Hello. Thank you for joining us for today's Ask the Pet Food Pro. I am Debbie Phillips Donaldson, Editor-in-Chief of Pet Food Industry and Pet Food Forum, and I'll be your moderator today. Ask the Pet Food Pro is a series of expert chats brought to you by Pet Food Forum and the editors of Pet Food Industry, and you can find our content at petfoodindustry.com. Today's chat addresses a popular and growing category of pet food, the freeze-dried space. It is sponsored by Parker Freeze Dry. Thanks very much to them for their support. Our experts today are Jared Ducklow, Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Parker Freeze Dry, and Sean Jones, founder of Food Dynamics. Welcome to Jared and Sean. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Debbie.
Before we start the discussion, I have a few quick announcements. First, you've all been muted to ensure everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. So please submit your questions or comments in the chat box. Some of you submitted questions beforehand, and we really appreciate those, and we'll try to get to as many as we can within the time allowed. And finally, this chat is being recorded. You can access the recording starting in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com. Click on the About tab at the top of the page, then select Ask the Pet Food Pro from the drop-down menu. So with that out of the way, we'll dive into today's topic. First, we wanted to get a sense of where all of you are in terms of using freeze drying and where your businesses are. So we have a quick poll. Hopefully everyone can see that. So it's just a couple of quick questions asking if you're using freeze drying now for pet food or treats, and then if you are, in what capacity. So as I said, we'll give everyone a few minutes to fill in your answers.
It says we can't vote, Jared.
Nope, sorry.
No.
I can't either. So far, we have about 70, almost 80% participation, and the no's are winning. So most people on the call are not using freeze drying yet, about 68% to 32. And then among the options of how they're using it, the majority are using a contract freeze drying facility or co-manufacturer. And then some, about 22% doing it themselves in their own facility. Some are doing it on their own. About the same amount of people, 17% are doing it on their own and are ready to scale up. Excuse me, which is the topic of today's discussion. Thank you all. Let me share the results. I get to do that. Can everyone see the results?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's start with the premise of today's topic, which is scaling up to achieve greater growth. And so, Sean and Jared, how common is it for people to start up their own small batch freeze-dried operations in pet food space? We have about, the total of 35% here who are doing that on their own. Is that a common thing as far as?
I think I'll start with that one, Debbie. We've got a significant amount of people that reach out to us on a weekly basis. They've been able to either create or validate various products for the pet food space that they're trying to get into. The stage of their development really varies with those groups and those discussions. Some of them are simply in the idea phase, and I typically reply that they should work with a group such as Foodynamics or just acquire a tabletop unit. Some of the hobbyist tabletop units are really good to go out and provide proof of concept. They can do some testing with those products and validate the concept in general. And then others are a little further along and they've already been doing that. They've actually got some sales. They're ready to scale up and take it to the next level. In those situations, then we start talking about what are the next steps in that process. And I know Sean receives a significant number of calls on this on a weekly basis as well. Sean, you want to share what you...
Definitely a few calls every week about people either inquiring about us doing the co-manufacturing, or they might have already proven their concept and they're asking us to get them to the next step to help them scale. One of the things that we often talk about is people would say, I have this idea of combining things like freeze-dried beef liver and turmeric or something like that. And we can certainly help them formulate that and do some test runs and things like that. However, that process gets pretty expensive to have us helping doing the formulation. So we do encourage people to get the tabletop unit and kind of prove their concept. And it really helps moving forward too, even if you do plan on using a co-man or you're going to just slowly scale your business. But it's really important to really understand the freeze drying process and what can be freeze dried, what can't be freeze dried, and things like that. But it's very common for us to talk with someone a couple times a week about just starting that process out and doing test runs.
Okay. If someone has reached that point of they think they're ready to scale up, they're outgrowing, say they have a tabletop unit and they're starting to outgrow that, where do they begin in terms of figuring out how to scale up? What are some of the first steps that they should take?
We work with a lot of customers that are just trying to assess where they are at in that cycle. The leap into commercial industrial can be a large one, and in some cases it can be accelerated growth, so to speak. But we try to understand not only where they're at but where they plan to go and help them plan for that future growth. Some groups need the co-packer assistance to help with that growth. We've got some customers with multiple units still using co-packer assistance as they process and go through that, because the need for space and financial backing can be very daunting. So we try to, from Parker's side, we try to help them walk through that process as opposed to just selling them a dryer. And I know Foodynamics is very similar, and obviously they use Parker units, and part of the reason that we're doing this call together is because we've worked together so long, and I think we work very concurrently in that process. Sean, what do you see with your groups that grow that way?
A couple of things came to mind immediately. The first one was, I don't think we would have been successful without, we decided we wanted to use our Parker unit when we scaled, but I don't think we would have reached the level of success that we had without the consultation that we received from Parker. So it just wasn't buying a machine and then scaling from there. It was really that really close consultative relationship that we had with you guys right from the beginning that really helped us scale. And then what came to mind right away were all the mistakes that we made before we bought the unit. And I say the first mistake is we definitely invested in too many tabletop units. That in retrospect, I look as one of our biggest mistakes. We probably should have gone, and I say we probably should have searched out for a co-packer to help us scale. And the time between having those tabletop units and actually ordering the commercial unit from you guys. But one of the other things, when we started, the small unit that Parker has, the Summit unit, didn't exist yet. That would have been a total game changer for us. We went from using all these tabletop units, not using a co-packer, and then we went right to a Parker 6. So we literally increased our capacity over the day we turned that unit on, increased our capacity by 1,500% right away. But there were a lot of segues that probably had started talking to Jared beforehand. They certainly would help us through that whole process and would have been a little smoother, would have been less financially painful as well.
Speaking of the financial pain, we had a question come in about what type of investment this entails. So can you give a ballpark range for what a tabletop unit costs?
Some of those brands out there are, as you can get into them for $3,000 to $5,000, and it provides you great proof of concept again. And you're going to struggle if you are running them on a daily basis. They're really more of a hobbyist tool, so to speak. But Sean talking about maybe going too far into the tabletop, I think he purchased so many, he finally decided to become a distributor for a short period.
And then I understand that Parker and other companies have different machines, different size machines. We actually just had a question come in. Is there a mid-range unit, say $50,000? And not to get too into the specifics of your equipment, but just to give people an idea of what the investment is if they want to do a commercial scale facility.
Yeah. And what I'll tell you, Debbie, is because I speak with a lot of customers, it's probably as we went smaller, as Sean alluded to with the Summit unit, one of the more challenging pieces that we didn't really anticipate were those people that were coming from the hobbyist tabletop units, and understanding it's not only an investment in the dryer, but there's a significant amount of ancillary requirements to get that food production in that space up and running, whether it's renting a facility and dicers and grinders and freezers and people, packaging equipment, all these different things. But if you go down to the specifics on our dryers, you can get into those units between 75,000. They go from about 75, 80,000, all the way up to as much as 1.3 million. In some cases, we've got groups that have multiple units of the larger size, which is typically about $1 million investment with extra equipment to be able to operate efficiently.
I think you make a good point. Sounds to me like it's like the extrusion process. And I have seen freeze drying operations, so I know that they are not simple. They're fairly complex, and it's like the extrusion process for people who might be familiar with that is that it's not just that big extruder. There's all kinds of equipment leading up to it and after it, and processes and things you need to know to make it all come together to create a quality product at an efficient price. I think it's important for people to know. That's the same with freeze drying. It's a complete operation.
Absolutely. And the other piece that I would stress is jumping from that tabletop hobbyist unit to a unit that runs. I think I saw one of the questions come through, the jump from $5 to $75, $80,000. It's critical to understand that these units that are industrial commercial that we build are designed to run 360 plus days a year. You've got some preventative maintenance that will account for those other 4 or 5 days, and you've got some holidays in there. In some cases, we have groups that are running 3 shifts. And in those cases, when they can minimize the cycle time by even a couple of hours, that ends up for 2 or 3 more runs each month, which obviously from an ROI perspective, it's extremely valuable. So understanding that when you go from the tabletop unit to even the Summit, but certainly to the larger ones, the tabletop units tend to have what I would call a default programming on it. And those cycle times are typically not reduced very far. And when you get to the commercial industrial unit, you've got the ability to do specific recipe profile programming. And you can shave off time. One of the biggest fallacies in freeze drying is people believe that you just add more heat and it's faster. The reality is there's a science to the process. It's batch processing. So typically in that line that you were referring to with all the ancillary products, the freeze dryer itself ends up being the slow point, the pinch point, whatever you want to call it, because it's a batch process. It takes a certain amount of time. And any other, whether it's Parker, whether it's any other group out there trying to sell this type of processing equipment, the reality is it is batch processing. You can automate and create continuation processes pre and post. However, the science itself is batch.
Gotcha. And so just back to the equipment for a second, and then I was going to go to you, Sean. So the tabletop unit sounds like it really is just a proof of concept, as you both have said several times. Whereas when you get into the larger equipment or work with a co-manufacturer, you're able to much better customize it to some extent for your specific product and operations.
Yeah, the customization is huge for us. And I have to say, our consistency and our quality improved when we went to a commercial unit. But I think anyone that's really considering scaling from those tabletop units to a commercial unit, probably if you're looking at the numbers of like how much a unit costs and how many pounds of raw product that it can freeze dry, that's not necessarily the right calculation to be looking at, because a couple of things happen. Having operated 30 of those tabletop units at a time, and like Jared mentioned, we were also a distributor of those tabletop units, so we were also selling them direct to consumers. We got pretty good at being able to repair them, but there probably wasn't one single time that a third of the machines were either not running or weren't running the way they should have. And when you look at the cost of a commercial machine, you don't just figure out how many pounds that you're freeze drying or what it can actually, what the output is. You have to figure the downtime, the maintenance, the quality, and the consistency of the product. And frankly, when you do scale, you also think about when you're able to adjust recipes. It's not always the case, but our commercial unit can freeze dry a lot of our products. It doesn't apply to all the products, but a lot of our products twice as fast. So being able to tweak those recipes a little bit, something that you really can't do in a tabletop unit. You can do it a little bit in a tabletop unit, but not even close to the extent that you can adjust the recipes in a commercial unit. So there's a lot more, and I always encourage contacting Parker Freeze Dry about talking through the machine and really helping think through some of those things. it wasn't until we started to talk to Parker that it really helped us. Maybe we didn't even know we were doing things inefficiently or wrong until we really got to talk to the experts.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah, Food Dynamics has been part of a co-manufacturer, and you just recently entered into a big deal, a merger. If you want to just explain that to people.
Just over 2 weeks ago, we were actually acquired by Glacial Freeze Dried. And part of that reason is we got to that scale where, and Jared alluded to this, where not only do you have to incur the costs of freeze dryers, but all the ancillary equipment, forklifts, freezers, dicer. One of the things that keeps me up at night is, it sounds silly, but is dishwash or pan washing. We're getting ready to wash thousands of pans a day. Do you have the geographic footprint to be able to accommodate all that? That's also one of the mistakes we made. Just to give you a little bit of our origin story, we started freeze drying in the back. We own retail pet stores. We were freeze drying in the back of the stores. Then we moved to a larger dedicated facility. And every single step of the way, including present day, we've never scaled to a large enough facility. Within 6 months, we've always scaled beyond the geographic requirements that we have. So we ended up outsourcing some of our dicing or doing packaging somewhere else, really being able to plan. And I think just as a caveat, it was like, if you're planning on scaling your freeze drying business, do realize that if you contact Parker, that will contribute to your success, because one of the things we never anticipated was the demand for our products. And you're always wanting to be conservative. This place is going to be big enough. You have these big eyes, and guarantee you 6 months or 12 months from now, the place isn't going to be big enough.
Yeah, because it's a quickly growing category.
Yeah, and the capital that's required, back to the financing, part of the reason why we have been searching for investors, and then you want to work with someone you don't feel like you're selling your soul to. But it took us a little while to realize that we really needed the capital. As Jared alluded to, some of these machines can be very north of $1 million. And it was just my wife and I funding this. So we just recognized that we really needed the best partner or the best opportunity to scale our business. And it's a lot about capital and working with experts on how to scale and automate things. And Parker was really, it just helped us. It's not like they told us what to do. They just helped us think through things like a good consultant would.
We had a question come in a little while ago. And by the way, for people who have specific questions about Parker's equipment, they will get all these questions and can follow up with you afterwards, because we are getting a few on that. Someone asked if the freeze drying process is it different in pet food or treats versus the human food space? And are there any other analogies or differences for anyone on the call who may be coming in from the human food space?
I think I'm going to defer to Sean. He certainly has more real life experiences. Obviously, we work with a lot of different groups in different industries, but he's done some of both.
So I think there's a lot of choices you can make right from the beginning when you're thinking about scaling a pet business. We made the choice. We always refer to ourselves as 2.0 pet parents, where we're really treating our pets like you would a family member. We made the choice right from the beginning that we were only going to have human grade. And I always think we have to be careful with that term human grade, because the USDA and the FDA don't really have that term. It's either edible or inedible. Most of what we choose to bring into our facility was intended for a human plate. There's some products that are automatically deemed inedible, like we freeze dry a lot of duck heads. How we source, and even if we're sourcing something that's considered to be inedible, we're working with our source to make sure it's harvested in a way that's safe and it's not going to be contaminated with anything. That's not always the choice that happens in the pet industry. So for us, the gap between human and pet there's not a huge gap in between those two. As far as the freeze drying process, it's very different. And I think this is something Jared would talk even more about. But doing meats, and especially offal livers and kidneys and really dense products, chicken breast, is going to freeze dry a little different than if you're doing fruits and vegetables or rice or other types of products. But that's the benefit we've experienced with Parker. The recipe system is so customizable. We have a recipe for beef liver. We have a recipe we do freeze dried bananas, completely different recipe, and it takes different times. Whereas in those tabletop units, you put them in there and pretty much you just press start and then it tries to tell you when it's done. And one of the other things when you talk about the difference between pet and human, more similarly, I think most of the people using tabletop units, they're assuming that it's done. And a lot of people are using this formula of weighing their products before and after they're freeze dried. And that is a food safety issue. You really want to start talking about water activity, and we can go
Hmm.
down that rabbit hole. That's one of the really important things to consider when you're scaling your business, that you really have to make sure that you have pathogen controls, that you have a HACCP for every single product, that whether it's human or pet, you really have to have those controls in place and these food hazard certifications. We treat things very differently at Foodynamics and at Glacial Freeze Dry in that we're treating everything in our facility like you would a human product.
Okay. Yeah, we just had a question come in, and I think it would be a little bit too much of a rabbit hole for this discussion, but there's a difference between a USDA facility versus feed grade facility, human grade facility versus pet feed. There definitely are
Yes,
differences
yes.
to the person asked that, and I would consult an entity like actually FDA or even AFCO would have in-depth information on that because again, it would be a rabbit hole for us to get into it. But to that point, you mentioned safety, others have mentioned safety. So that we did get quite a few questions about regarding safety and freeze drying. So talking about the process itself, you mentioned HACCP, Sean. Is there a kill step in freeze drying? If not, what are some of the critical control points that people should be keeping in mind in terms of making sure that their freeze-dried foods and treats are safe?
Debbie, I'll take the first attempt to answer this one. It's probably the most commonly asked, and it's probably the hardest question to answer when it comes to freeze drying. The bottom line is most kill steps include heat, and freeze drying is the process itself is trying to avoid heat as much as possible and still dry the product. We have the ability to add a tremendous amount of heat in the Parker dryers, and some customers are choosing this option in the process. But when you do that, you're also giving up some of the nutritional value. It just, they counteract. It's a catch 22 there. It's give and take. So when some customers are using this process, it's critical to understand. One of the universities that we work with, they started talking about the fact that the FDA doesn't recognize a kill step under 5% moisture content. Freeze drying process, we can get down to as low as 1.5 to 2%. So obviously adding heat at the end of the process doesn't make a lot of sense. We do have some customers that are extremely successful in adding heat earlier on in the process. Depending upon the product, in some cases, they're seeing 100% effective rate. Is it validated? No. And I think what
Okay.
you're seeing is it's pretty early in the process. So people that are having success do not necessarily want to give away their secret recipe. So there's a little bit of the chicken and the egg out there on that, but working through it. Obviously, there are other options, whether it be chemical processes, microwaves, radiation, HPP, those types of things that can assist with that process. But in most cases, part of the reason that the people are doing the freeze drying is for the nutritional value, whether you're degrading it with heat or with other additives or other processes, they want to avoid that if at all possible. I don't know, Sean, anything to add to that?
That was pretty comprehensive. When people were talking about bird flu, we had a few inquiries, not as many as we thought we would. The interesting thing is how you source makes a big difference too. My response to most of the customers that asked us about it was the way we source, probably when the local grocery store is sounding the alarm or not able to get certain products because of the risk of bird flu, that's when we would have the same issue or a big issue. So I think sourcing can go a really long way as far as food safety. And then we do use a similar process during our freeze drying recipes it is a bit proprietary in what we do, but I think it's something to consider is deciding what you want to do for the kill step. But in the raw food industry, this is an ongoing debate and discussion
Sure.
about what the
Sure.
best, and it's the same thing for freeze drying. I don't think it's much different for freeze dried as it is in all of the real or fresh food industry. So I don't know if you agree with that, Jared, but it is pretty much the same as any of the raw food companies and what they're facing. The big difference with us is we have a potential way to reduce that pathogen risk, but it's basically the same debate.
And let's be honest, the pet food industry has been probably one of the first industries to introduce sustainability, and they're really human seconds. The question, what is the quality of that product? How long is it sat around? We've worked with a lot of customers, and that sourcing question is one that I often ask early on in our discussions to understand what are we dealing with, what is the situation, and how do we approach it. It varies. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. There is a specific question. Jared, you mentioned HPP, so high pressure processing for those who aren't familiar with the acronym. Why would that, in combination with freeze drying for food safety purposes, not be a standard choice since HPP isn't believed to negatively impact the nutritional content of the food?
Some people choose to do that and some people choose not to. There are different implications with different products. We work very closely with a couple of HPP groups, and it can be extremely successful in that process. It's a pre-freeze dry process that is utilized. It can have different impact on the product. It depends on if it's a natural product, if there's proteins that have been ground, and there's different challenges that can be faced with different processes throughout, but it is utilized in a lot of different aspects for the kill step prior to freeze drying.
And what I have to add to that is twofold. The one is I would say take a really close look at some of the research on it and really decide whether the research design on there is valid, even though what they're reporting seems pretty valid. The second thing is we have some customers that they send us a product that's already been HPP'd. We have a HPP facility nearby that's probably about 30 minutes from us. So it goes there first, they HPP it. From a food safety aspect, you have to think about the process. So they put it in a plastic bag, it's delivered to us. And the first thing we do when it gets here, we cut open that plastic bag and expose it to whatever would be in our facility. And we have very stringent food safety protocols here, but it still is something that has to happen pre-freeze drying. A lot of our customers, they'll do a lot of testing.
I was going to ask that that seems to me like from what I know, that would be a very smart strategy to have is to test at various stages along the processing and then definitely the finished product before releasing.
And it adds a significant cost to do that level of testing.
Sure.
But we talk to a lot of pet food companies that we don't make anything for. And I just asked that question, is your freeze dried product HPP'd? And a lot of them are telling us no. And was actually surprising. Their raw foods are HPP'd, but anything being freeze dried, they're not sending through that process.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier, Sean, about water activity. I know that's not exactly the same as the water content of the product, but someone asked what other methods do you use outside of weighing the product to check for dryness or water content?
I don't believe there's any benefit from a food safety standpoint in weighing the product because you're not measuring the stability of that product by weighing. Probably to help you reconstitute the product, you know how much water to add to rehydrate it. But water activity is very different than moisture. And there's certain water activity measures that would indicate that it's shelf stable and pathogens cannot grow in that environment. And there's still moisture in our product. And you do see some freeze-dried products with lower the water activity, obviously the drier the product is. But that's when you see all the stuff when you see it crumbling, it's difficult for adhesion. But water activity is pretty much the industry standard to determine whether the product is shelf stable. And so when the Parker system, we do sometimes more than water activity sample on each cart that comes out of our freeze dryer. And we've been able to dial in those recipes based on water activity because you don't want it to be too dry, but also you don't want to be close to that threshold where pathogens could grow in the product.
Sure. What about antioxidants or any kind of preservatives? We had a question come in earlier about that. Are those commonly used in freeze-dried products? Should they be? What's the expertise on that?
Jared, do you want to hit that one first?
Sure, I'll hit it first and I'll turn it over to you. But again, we're going back to the product because we're getting down to that moisture content level and that water activity level that we've referred to so many times. The pathogen activity is minimized. And we're a big believer, not only for pets, but also on the human consumption side. There's so much waste out there. And I think one of the workshops that we participated in, the carbon footprint is large as 30 to 40% of the carbon footprint revolves around food waste. And
Sure.
that can be from various things like just during the harvest, maybe an apple orchard, the apples hit the ground and how much of them never actually make it to a plate, people wasteful, not eating it in time and what have you. We still have to go put in a tremendous amount of the carbon footprint in order to process it and make it. And if we can find ways to assist in that by not adding those antioxidants and other products to food, and it becomes natural, it's a much healthier way, whether it's for a pet, whether it's for humans. There's certainly significant opportunities there. And I do know that in some cases, some of our customers add some of those to their products and what have you. And that's more of a business strategy choice that each one of those make. And I'll turn it over to Sean there.
Adding any type of preservative to a freeze-dried product, there's probably no reason to do it. I know there were some questions earlier about packaging, but most of the products in the pet industry are dated for expiration within 18 months. And most of our customers are packaging their product in standard packaging. A lot of people believe that freeze-dried products have to be stored in a Mylar bag, and that's not really true. If you wanted to have that shelf stability of 25 years, freeze-dried food can last. Absolutely. Mylar bags are very durable. It's easy to vacuum seal and get all the oxygen out, and then it can be shelf stable for that time period. But you don't have to package freeze-dried products in a Mylar bag. You can use the standard packaging. I think I'm actually not aware of any pet companies that are using Mylar bags for retail packaging. It's incredibly expensive. We don't add any or recommend adding any type of preservative because freeze drying, in my opinion, is probably the world's most effective and efficient way to preserve food because it can last for 25 years without any degradation. In the pet industry, you see a lot of synthetic vitamins added to products. Having formulated food on my side, we use a formulation that you can formulate a complete AFCO diet without adding synthetic vitamins. I believe the only reason you add synthetic vitamins is because the actual food ingredients themselves weren't enough to meet the minimum AFCO standard. Because you can meet an AFCO standard without adding those synthetic vitamins or preservatives.
Okay. So it sounds to me, I think I know the answer to this question, but someone just posted, what about using things like oxygen absorbers or desiccants? Are those commonly used? Do you recommend them at all?
Sean?
So yes, the ultimate way would be to totally vacuum seal the product so there isn't any oxygen in the product. We have had some customers that have asked us to nitrogen fill packages or to argon fill packages to get the oxygen. So oxygen can cause oxidation. We do put an oxygen absorber inside all of the retail packaging that we package for our customers.
Okay.
Is it completely necessary? I can't say that it is because when we do send things out for the aging studies, it's interesting with freeze-dried food because if you send our products for aging studies or stability studies, they use heat to accelerate the results. And it doesn't really, I'm not even sure how it really impacts the freeze drying, but freeze-dried products, even without that oxygen absorber in there, last a really long time, way beyond the standard 18 months in the pet industry.
And Sean, I think if I could add to it, it's important to understand the different products that are in those bags, especially you see a lot in the pet food side with the proteins and so forth. As people are aware, the fats don't typically freeze dry really well. And so when you start talking about different products, it's one thing that you have to consider and account for fats and oils and so forth. So it can play into how you're packaging that product.
I actually had a question come in about what's in the products, but go ahead, Sean.
No, that was an excellent point because we see that where sometimes apples and bananas, if you leave them exposed, will rehydrate from the humidity in the air.
Interesting. So back to the whole idea of testing and shelf stability. How, if someone asked how you're assessing that in freeze-dried products stability, are you measuring peroxide values or PAV or T-bar or others. I'm not even sure what those processes are, but I'm not a safety expert by any means. So yeah, so is it a p-value thing? Is it other measurements that you're doing?
I try to stay out of that side of it as much as I can, Debbie, but I know Sean deals with it on a daily basis.
We send everything out to an external lab. We don't want to be in that business. I know just in our pet stores, a lot of times we'll have a space in our pet store where we just leave the stuff out on a shelf without any packaging whatsoever. And there's some products that have been there for years now, and every once in a while we test for water activity and they're still good. However, we always recommend using a certified lab, and then they'll report back to you every month on the shelf stability and the aging study. We don't want to be responsible for that for any of the brands that we produce for.
Okay, that makes sense. And then back to back to the question about oxygen absorbers. Someone asked if you know that your products will last 18 months or longer, why are you still using the oxygen absorbers? Is that just for peace of mind, safety for some of your customers, additional safety?
The reason we do it is because we're not vacuum sealing all of our product. So we put them
Okay.
in there. And if you put too large of an oxygen absorber in the packaging, you can see it, it will suck up all the oxygen and it'll shrink that bag almost like it looks like it's vacuum sealed. A bad process, and they're not incredibly expensive to put into the bags. Yep.
Okay.
And I always think too, if a bag was punctured or something, it would still give you some protection.
Sure. Yeah. You can't completely control what happens once they leave the factory. So let's pivot a little bit more to talk about the products themselves. And this kind of alludes to some of the things that we've already talked about, including synthetic vitamins. But someone's asking, when you mentioned both the fats and oils in protein products. So this person is saying a lot of freeze-dried products are meat forward. Are you seeing more of this, or are you doing more with, say, fruits and vegetables incorporated to make part of a larger, more complete and balanced mix? And to your point, Jared, is that one way to get all the vitamins in that are necessary to AFCO standards? So it's talking about what about formulation really for a complete and balanced diets.
We see a wide variety of approaches to that, and certainly the fruits and vegetables are additives that we are seeing, and typically the product is mixed in. We do have some customers that are processing those products separately and then grinding, repelletizing, and forming. However, the majority of them are doing that pre-freeze drying process. That's typically what we see. And I know Sean mixes some in. He's got a couple products out there. I think it's a pet donut, Sean.
It's not a complete diet, but we were sitting around one night in our pet store and we were thinking, to some extent, a lot of the freeze-dried products look boring. They're freeze-dried chicken hearts and stuff like that. But even in our pet store, people that I think are feeding really well, they want to feed a really cute treat. And so we took some chicken breast and ground it up and threw some cranberries or blueberries in there and made a donut out of it. And they really sell well. And it just comes out beautiful. But far as the complete diets go, we don't try to go down the rabbit hole of talking about complete diets too much. It's something that we like talking to our customers about. But there's a lot of raw foods on the market today, raw and freeze-dried products that don't have synthetic vitamins in the formula or any types of preservatives. I can tell you they cost a lot more.
Sure.
Like
Yeah. I was just thinking
double-digit
that,
percentages more.
yeah. So it's a business strategy,
It is.
really, as you were
It is.
both alluding to earlier. We're still on the shelf stability question. Someone was asking, so when outsourced to a third-party lab, Sean, what measures do they use? Are they reporting back to you on water activity or fat assessment or anything? Because she was saying that she's spoken to a few different labs and there's not a uniform consensus between them on what they measure.
It's really up to that customer what they want to measure. We test for water activity internally. We do several tests on each cart that comes out of the freeze dryer. We send our machines out for validation, and then we actually validate them on a regular basis. So we have the water activity machines aren't cheap, but they come with a validation process. But we also send it out for validation. You can send the products for water activity and for pathogen analysis, for nutritional analysis, like the whole AFCO panel. You can send it out to a laboratory and they'll come back with that panel. We have individual ingredients that go out for analysis for nutrient density, and it fits into some of the software that they use for formulating food. So it's something very specific that'll be proprietary to brands.
So it really depends on if someone wants to measure for safety or nutritional
Yeah, we have customers that when we scan every single box, so they're sending in pallets and pallets of raw materials themselves, and we do toll processing for them. But we scan the boxes, we test each box, and then this is for the customer. We send lab results when it arrives in our facility. We send lab results when it goes through any dicing, and we send lab results after it's freeze dried. That's not something that we require or we do, but it's something that our customers choose to do. And it's something that they report to their end consumers, to the pet parents that they make products for, and it's their choice.
Okay. And back to this kind of all ties into what's actually in the food because these products tend to be meat forward, as someone put it. Are palatants used at all in freeze-dried products?
And I don't know,
Yeah,
Jared
most
probably has
customers,
customers that do.
some do, but again, back to it is a natural product. In most cases, they're not typically necessary. And what the freeze drying process is doing, and we're taking that water out of it in its simplest format, right? We're taking ice and converting it directly to a gas so we can leave behind the solids. And in those cases, you typically have smell and taste, which is still there, remains there. Texture is going to be a little different because the moisture content is so different. However, that smell and taste is what typically appeals to the pet anyway. That's why it's been so successful in this industry.
And I always tell people, if you really want to understand the value, the palatability for pets, try something like freeze-dried strawberries or apples or pineapple or cheesecake, freeze-dried cheesecake. Highly recommend it. Just realize that when you start to rehydrate it with your own saliva, it has a very powerful, intense
Yeah.
flavor because it's not diluted by the moisture. I can smell freeze-dried beef liver from 100 feet away. A dog could probably do it for a mile because it is so powerful. I don't think I'll ever get it out of my nose, but it's really amazing. And we own pet stores too. And one of the funny things is we'll get these finicky dogs or even cats that come into our store and they'll say, "Can we give them a treat?" And they'll say, "Oh, they won't eat it." And I was like, 9 times out of 10, we'll find something that they'll eat that the pet parent didn't think they would. And it's always
Yes.
right.
I can attest to that. I had a very finicky cat and he's been gone a little while now, but he would not eat hardly any treats, but freeze-dried ones he would at least try because probably the smell.
Oh, I was gonna say it's one of those amazing things for cats that they put the finicky in finicky. And I would say if you ever wanted to convert a cat to raw, freeze dried is a good place to start, and then just start increasing the moisture level over a period of time. Because a lot of cats, they get really imprinted on food. We've
Yes.
had tremendous success getting cats to eat raw food by starting with freeze dried.
Interesting. Or as toppers, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So this might be a good question to end on, although we probably could talk about it for a good 15, 20 minutes. But this is someone who says they've been in the freeze-dried pet treat business for less than a year, and they've noticed a lot of bigger brands starting to catch on and enter the space. So from your perspective, is there still room for newer businesses to grow? And what should they keep in mind as the category becomes saturated? Yeah, because of I'm going to add my own little editorial to that. You're seeing these bigger companies getting into the fresh, freeze-dried, whatever space. Hills bought a company earlier this year. General Mills announced something. Someone else recently I think it was Mars maybe. So they're seeing the growth in these categories and they're coming into them. I think the question is, what does that mean for some of these businesses that are on this call right now who are starting out smaller? Is there going to be room in the space for them too?
I think, Debbie, I'll take the first shot and then Sean can share the real life experience. But I'll tell you that we work with a lot of what I categorize as smaller groups. Anything compared to some of those corporate groups that you had mentioned would be considered small. The nice, interesting, and fun part about the pet industry is that it allows for all of these groups to try something and to create a new product and get successful and grow into that. It's actually much more common than on the human consumption side. As we sell dryers, we see it much more so in the pet industry. Keep in mind that what we're typically talking about is someone like Sean who sees an opportunity for a premium pet product and holds to those values of offering something that's extremely good for a pet over time to help their pet stay around a little bit longer. And when you start to get to those larger companies, unfortunately, they have investors and stockholders that they have to report to. And a lot of times, some of that gets lost in that process as you sell to larger companies. And so, from our perspective, the groups that we work with, we're ideally in the middle of that tabletop unit and then entire facilities. And we want to grow with the customers as they grow. And because of that, we don't deal a tremendous amount with those larger corporations that you've talked about.
The smaller companies can usually be more nimble and innovative and experiment a little bit more, I think.
Yeah.
And, and having I own 2 independent pet stores, and I can just say being able to tell your story to the pet parents, that's something with the larger scale pet food companies can't say. You can talk about direct the source. And I always say the competition or the growth of the freeze-dried industry is good for everybody. The more people that understand the benefits of feeding a freeze-dried product, the better. We always think after the pandemic that you would see a decrease or a plateauing of the business, and ours continues to explode. We continue to make the mistake of not scaling large enough every single time. And I always say the more choices they are, the more likely the consumers are going to buy a freeze-dried product. And I always challenge people. I always use this example. If you see a Pepsi machine, your decision's whether you want a Pepsi or not. But if you see a Pepsi machine and a Coke machine next to each other, now your decision is whether you want a Coke or a Pepsi. Now you're definitely a buyer. So sometimes the more choices there are out there, you all grow the industry.
Great point. Great point. Okay, I think with that, we will end. Thank you again, Sean and Jared, for your expertise and insights. Really great discussion. Thanks again to Parker Freeze Dry for their generous support. Please watch for future Ask the Pet Food Pro discussions coming this year, and we also have webinars that are announced on our website. We have a few live events coming up. The dates are here on the screen. Pet Food Forum Asia in Bangkok in a couple of months, and then the date you can save for next year for Pet Food Forum. Finally, just a reminder that the recording of this chat will be available in about a week, also on petfoodforumevents.com under the About tab. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day or evening.